Mrs. Maria's house was silent, except for the sighs of pain coming from her room. Her 3 grown-up children were gathered in the living room, their faces expressing a mix of concern and determination. "We need to make a decision about what to do with Mom's house," said the eldest son, John, in a serious tone. "She's already very ill and can't take care of the house on her own anymore," added the middle child, Mary Ann, with sorrow. "We can't leave her here in these conditions." The youngest, Peter, crossed his arms over his chest. "I say we should sell the house and split the money between us. That way, each of us can take care of Mom in our own way." John and Mary Ann looked at each other, hesitant. "But what if she needs that money for medical care?" questioned Mary Ann. "Oh, she has her retirement and health insurance. We don't need to worry about that," Peter replied, with a satisfied smile. After a long discussion, the 3 children finally reached an agreement. They would sell their mother's house and divide the profit among themselves. John suggested putting Mrs. Maria in a nursing home with a private nurse to take care of her. "That way, we won't have to worry about her," concluded Peter, ignoring the looks of discomfort from John and Mary Ann. With the decision made, the children now prepared to communicate their choice to their mother, unaware that their actions would drastically change the course of their lives. Mrs. Maria's house, once so full of life, now seemed to be enveloped in a heavy mantle of silence. The sighs of pain echoing from the mother's room traveled through the hallways, reaching the ears of her 3 children gathered in the living room. John, the eldest, cleared his throat and began, "We need to make a decision about what to do with Mom's house. She can't take care of it on her own anymore in these conditions." His tone was grave, reflecting the concern he felt. Mary Ann, the middle child, nodded her head. "That's true. We can't leave her here in this situation." She seemed distressed, her hands restless in her lap. Peter, the youngest, crossed his arms over his chest and said determinedly, "I say we should sell the house and split the money between us. That way, each of us can take care of Mom in our own way." John and Mary Ann looked at each other, uncertain. "But what if she needs that money for medical care?" Mary Ann asked with concern. "Oh, she has her retirement and health insurance. We don't need to worry about that," Peter replied, smiling satisfactorily. After a long and tense discussion, the 3 children finally reached an agreement. They would sell their mother's house and divide the profit among themselves. John suggested putting Mrs. Maria in a nursing home with a private nurse to take care of her. "That way, we won't have to worry about her," concluded Peter, ignoring the uncomfortable looks from John and Mary Ann. With the decision made, the children prepared to communicate their choice to their mother, unaware of the consequences their actions would unleash. Mrs. Maria, lying in her bed, heard her children's conversation with a mix of sadness and disappointment. She knew her health was deteriorating, but she had never imagined that her own children would abandon her in this way. Tears silently streamed down her face as she watched the bedroom door, hoping someone would come to offer her comfort. However, the children, immersed in their own ambitions and interests, didn't even think to consult their mother about their decisions. They simply placed her in a nursing home, with only a nurse to care for her, and left, dividing the proceeds from the sale of the house among themselves. Mrs. Maria found herself alone, in a strange environment, surrounded by people she didn't know. Her heart was heavy, the pain of feeling abandoned by her own family was almost unbearable. She felt helpless and without the strength to fight her illness. While the children celebrated their good fortune, Mrs. Maria retreated to her room, hugging herself and crying silently, trying to understand how her family had reached this point. After the sale of Mrs. Maria's house, the three children quickly divided the money between them. John, Marianne, and Peter each received a considerable share, enough to begin enjoying a life of luxury and comfort. John bought a sports car, Marianne organized a dream trip to Europe, and Peter invested in new businesses. They distanced themselves more and more from their mother, immersed in their own lives. Mrs. Maria, now living in a nursing home, sadly watched out the window as the days passed. She anxiously awaited visits from her children, but they simply did not show up. Weeks turned into months, and soon it had been 3 years since she had been abandoned in that strange place. "Children, why have you forgotten me?" she whispered, tears streaming down her aged face. "I need you so much." Mrs. Maria tried to maintain hope that her children would return, but the loneliness and sadness weighed more and more heavily upon her. She felt profoundly helpless, completely adrift in that nursing home. The nurse who cared for her, Nurse Joanna, noticed the old woman's anguish and tried to offer her as much comfort and attention as possible. She would talk with Mrs. Maria, listen to her laments, and try to cheer her up, but nothing seemed to alleviate her pain. "My children no longer care about me," Mrs. Maria would say, her voice heavy with sadness. "They have abandoned me here, all alone." Nurse Joanna would gently squeeze the old woman's hand, trying to comfort her. "You are not alone, Mrs. Maria. I am here to take care of you." But Nurse Joanna's words seemed to echo emptily in Mrs. Maria's ears. She felt that her children, those she had loved so much, had turned their backs on her when she needed them most. Day after day, Mrs. Maria sank further into a deep depression. She refused to eat properly and lost the motivation for any activity. Her already frail health seemed to be deteriorating even more in that lonely environment. Meanwhile, the children continued to enjoy their luxuries and comfortable lives, without worrying about their mother's well-being. They had completely forgotten their true duty, to care for the one who had given them life. Mrs. Maria, once so strong and determined, now felt completely abandoned, without the strength to fight the suffering that consumed her day by day in that nursing home. Despite her poor health and the abandonment by her children, Mrs. Maria found the strength to fight against the sadness that consumed her in the nursing home. She observed with attention the dedication and care of Nurse Joanna, who did everything to make her days more pleasant. "Nurse Joanna, you are so kind to me," said Mrs. Maria, holding the nurse's hand. "I feel so alone here, but you bring me comfort." Nurse Joanna smiled with compassion. "Don't worry, Mrs. Maria. I will be here to take care of you. I know this situation is not easy, but we will get through it together." Mrs. Maria nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "My children have abandoned me. They no longer care about me." She sighed deeply, the weight of loneliness heavy on her heart. "You are a strong woman," Nurse Joanna encouraged her. "I'm sure you can overcome this. We just need to find a purpose for you to move forward." These words awakened something within Mrs. Maria. She remembered her many years of experience as a successful businesswoman. "Perhaps I can use my knowledge to create something new here," she murmured, her eyes gaining a determined spark. In the following days, Mrs. Maria began to get involved in activities at the nursing home, talking to other residents and observing the care provided by the nurse. She noticed the efficiency and dedication of Nurse Joanna, who seemed genuinely concerned about the well-being of everyone. "Nurse Joanna, I have an idea," Mrs. Maria said one day, her voice strong and resolute. What do you think about us two opening a health clinic here? I could use my business knowledge to manage it, and you could take care of the patients." Nurse Joanna's eyes widened, surprised by the proposal. "A clinic? But you are ill, Mrs. Maria. Wouldn't it be better for you to focus on your own recovery?" Mrs. Maria smiled determinedly. "That's precisely why I need to stay busy and have a purpose. Moreover, this clinic could help improve my health. What do you say, Nurse Joanna? Let's do this together." After a few moments of hesitation, Nurse Joanna nodded, touched by Mrs. Maria's passion and resolve. "Very well, Mrs. Maria. Let's put this plan into action. Together, we will succeed." A new spark of hope ignited in Mrs. Maria's eyes. She was determined not to be defeated by her children's abandonment and to use her talents to create something that would keep her motivated and healthy. With Nurse Joanna by her side, Mrs. Maria began to outline the plans for a new venture that would change the course of her life. After sharing her ambitious idea with Nurse Joanna, Mrs. Maria eagerly awaited the nurse's response. She knew it would be a challenge, but her determination to create something new and give a new direction to her life was unshakable. "Nurse Joanna, what do you think of my proposal to open a health clinic together?" Mrs. Maria asked, holding the nurse's hands with enthusiasm. Nurse Joanna pondered for a few moments, her face reflecting a mix of concern and admiration. "Mrs. Maria, I understand your desire to stay busy and have a purpose, but this seems like a very risky undertaking for you, in your state of health." Mrs. Maria nodded, understanding the nurse's concerns. "I know, Nurse Joanna. But it is precisely because I am ill that I need to stay active and have a goal to achieve. This clinic could be the key to my recovery." She squeezed Nurse Joanna's hands gently. "You are the only person I can trust. I need your help to make this dream a reality." Nurse Joanna sighed deeply, but her eyes shone with a spark of hope. "Very well, Mrs. Maria. If you are determined, then I will help you make this plan work." A broad smile illuminated Mrs. Maria's face. "I knew you would understand. Together, we will turn this idea into something incredible." In the following days, the two women met several times, mapping out a detailed plan for the health clinic. Mrs. Maria, with her vast business experience, led the discussions on the administrative structure, the business model, and the fundraising efforts. Nurse Joanna, with her medical and nursing knowledge, contributed ideas about the services to be offered, the team of healthcare professionals to be hired, and the best practices for patient care. "We need to find a suitable location for the clinic and secure the necessary financing to get it up and running," Mrs. Maria said, her eyes shining with determination. Nurse Joanna nodded, jotting down the information in her notebook. "I can talk to some contacts I have in the healthcare field. Maybe we can find some investors interested in this project." With the dedication of both women, the clinic's business plan became increasingly solid and viable. Mrs. Maria, despite her poor health, tirelessly devoted herself to reviewing financial projections, developing marketing strategies, and discussing operational details. "We're going to make this happen, Nurse Joanna," Mrs. Maria affirmed, her voice firm and confident. "This clinic will be the beginning of a new chapter in my life. A chapter where I will no longer be an abandoned woman, but a successful businesswoman." Nurse Joanna smiled, moved by Mrs. Maria's determination. "I believe in you, Mrs. Maria. Together, we will turn this dream into reality." With Mrs. Maria's willpower and Nurse Joanna's dedication, the health clinic plan began to take shape, bringing a new horizon of hope to the life of the woman who had been abandoned by her own children. With determination and commitment, Mrs. Maria and Nurse Joanna put their plan into action. After months of intense preparation, the new health clinic was finally inaugurated. The facility was spacious and welcoming, with modern equipment and a highly qualified team of professionals. From the very first day, the clinic attracted the attention of the community, who sought the healthcare services offered with such dedication. "Look, Nurse Joanna, the clinic is already full of patients," Mrs. Maria exclaimed, her eyes shining with pride. "Our efforts are truly bearing fruit." Nurse Joanna smiled, admiring Mrs. Maria's energy and enthusiasm. "You're right, Mrs. Maria. This clinic will become a great success, thanks to your leadership and determination." Mrs. Maria nodded, her chest swelling with satisfaction. "I never thought I could create something so wonderful after being so abandoned by my own children. But with your help, Nurse Joanna, anything seems possible." In the following months, the health clinic thrived rapidly. Patients from the entire region sought the services of the specialized team, impressed by the quality of care and the dedication shown to each one of them. Mrs. Maria, despite her health limitations, led the management of the clinic with a firm hand and strategic vision. She meticulously cared for every aspect of the business, from hiring new professionals to implementing process improvements. "I feel so alive and fulfilled here," Mrs. Maria confided to Nurse Joanna in one of their meetings. "This clinic has given me a new purpose, a new drive to fight my illness." Nurse Joanna gently squeezed her friend's hand, her gaze overflowing with affection and admiration. "I'm so proud of you, Mrs. Maria. You are an extraordinary woman, and this clinic is proof of that." Over time, Mrs. Maria's health began to gradually improve. Her involvement with the clinic, the daily activities, and the sense of purpose seemed to revitalize her. She felt more energized, her energy and enthusiasm increasing day by day. "Look at me, Nurse Joanna," Mrs. Maria said, beaming with a smile. "I feel like a new woman. This clinic has saved me, given me a reason to live." Nurse Joanna nodded, emotional. "You deserve all the success, Mrs. Maria. Together, we've built something incredible that will help so many people." Mrs. Maria squeezed Nurse Joanna's hand, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude. "I can never thank you enough for being by my side, Nurse Joanna. This clinic is our legacy, our victory over abandonment and sadness." Together, the two women contemplated the success of the clinic, which had become not only a thriving business, but also a symbol of Mrs. Maria's strength, determination, and renewal. She, once a sick and abandoned woman, now shone as a successful businesswoman, a living proof that it was possible to overcome the greatest challenges. While Mrs. Maria gradually recovered and the health clinic prospered under her leadership, her children remained distant, immersed in their own lives. John, Marianne, and Peter had divided the money from the sale of their mother's house and gone their separate ways. They spent the money on lavish trips, sports cars, and new businesses, without worrying about Mrs. Maria's well-being. Mrs. Maria, however, felt the absence of her children more and more. Despite the success of the clinic and the company of Nurse Joanna, her heart grew heavier with loneliness. "It's been so long since I've seen my children," Mrs. Maria confessed to Nurse Joanna, her voice choked with sadness. "Have they completely forgotten about me?" Nurse Joanna gently squeezed her friend's hand, her eyes reflecting concern. "I'm sure they haven't forgotten you, Mrs. Maria. Perhaps they are just busy with their own lives." Mrs. Maria sighed deeply. I know, Nurse Joanna. But they abandoned me when I needed them the most. Do they no longer care about me? Tears streamed down Mrs. Maria's aged face, and Nurse Joanna embraced her tenderly, trying to comfort her. Don't lose hope, Mrs. Maria. Your children will one day realize how much you need them. In the months that followed, Mrs. Maria tried to keep her focus on the clinic, but her mind always returned to her absent children. She observed the families that visited the clinic, noticing how her patients received the support and affection of their loved ones. Why don't my children come visit me? Mrs. Maria would murmur, her gaze lost through the window of the waiting room. Don't they care about how much I'm improving? Nurse Joanna noticed her friend's sadness and tried to cheer her up, inviting her to participate in recreational activities at the clinic. But nothing seemed to fill the void left by the absence of her children. I feel so alone, Nurse Joanna, Mrs. Maria confessed one afternoon, her eyes filled with sorrow. I'm so proud of our clinic, but my heart is heavy with the lack of my family. Nurse Joanna wrapped Mrs. Maria in a comforting embrace. I know, my friend. I'm so sorry your children are not here to share in this victory of yours. But know that I will always be by your side. Mrs. Maria nodded, trying to hold back the tears. Thank you, Nurse Joanna. You are the only family I have now. But I still hope that my children will understand how much I need them. As the clinic prospered and Mrs. Maria's health improved, she felt increasingly alone, as her own children had forgotten her, immersed in their lives of luxury and comfort. Mrs. Maria fought not to be overcome by loneliness, but her heart yearned for the affection and presence of those who should have been by her side. 3 years after abandoning Mrs. Maria in a nursing home, the 3 children, John, Mary Ann, and Peter, began to feel the weight of guilt on their conscience. John, the eldest, looked out the window of his office, watching life go by. Is Mom doing okay? Has she needed us all this time? Mary Ann, sitting on her comfortable sofa, sighed deeply. I feel horrible for leaving her in that home. Is she sick, all alone? Peter, relaxing on his porch after a lavish lunch, also couldn't shake the thoughts about his mother. Did we do the right thing by selling the house and putting her there? A deep sense of remorse began to settle in the hearts of the 3 children. They realized that in their greed and selfishness, they had abandoned Mrs. Maria at a time of great vulnerability. How could we do this to her? Mary Ann lamented, tears streaming down her face. She needed us so much, and we left her to fend for herself. John nodded, the guilt weighing heavily on his shoulders. We have to go visit her. See how she's doing, apologize. I can't bear to think of her alone, sick. Peter hesitated, feeling ashamed. What if she doesn't want to see us? We've been gone for so long. Then we'll have to make her forgive us, Mary Ann stated, determined. She's our mother, we can't continue to ignore her. Gathered together, the 3 children agreed that it was time to face Mrs. Maria and confront the consequences of their actions. They knew it wouldn't be easy, as the guilt consumed them, but they felt it was their duty to try to repair the damage they had caused. Let's visit Mom tomorrow, John declared. We need to ask for forgiveness and see how she's doing. We can't run away from this responsibility anymore. Mary Ann and Peter nodded, their faces reflecting concern and regret. They knew facing Mrs. Maria would be a challenge, but they were determined to try to fix the mistake they had made in abandoning her. As the day of the visit approached, the 3 children felt increasingly anxious. They feared their mother's reaction and the pain they might cause by reliving it. But, above all, they needed to confront the truth. They had neglected Mrs. Maria when she needed them the most. Driven by guilt and remorse, John, Mary Ann, and Peter finally decided to visit Mrs. Maria. They approached the health clinic with heavy hearts, fearing their mother's reaction. As they neared the entrance, they were surprised to see the impressive facade and the sign with the clinic's name. The Mrs. Maria Clinic. Mary Ann murmured, perplexed. John frowned. What's going on here? Is Mom really doing well? His voice reflected the concern that consumed him. Peter swallowed hard. Let's go, let's face this once and for all. We need to ask Mom for forgiveness. With hesitant steps, the three children entered the clinic. They were greeted by a friendly nurse, who escorted them to the director's office. Mrs. Maria will see you in a moment, the nurse said, her smile kind. When the door opened, the children held their breath. There stood Mrs. Maria, upright and radiant. She received them with a serene expression, but her eyes reflected a mixture of kindness and hurt. Hello, my children. What an unexpected surprise, Mrs. Maria said, her voice soft yet firm. John, Mary Ann, and Peter looked at each other, astonished. This was not the same woman they had left in the nursing home, sick and abandoned. Mom, we came to visit you, Mary Ann stammered, tears streaming down her face. We're so sorry for leaving you. Mrs. Maria nodded, her expression impassive. I see. It's been a long time, hasn't it? John stepped forward, the guilt etched in his eyes. Mom, please forgive us. We didn't know how much you needed us. Peter, who had always been the most selfish, lowered his head, ashamed. We made a mistake, Mom. We abandoned you when you needed us the most. Mrs. Maria observed them in silence for a few moments, her eyes shining with an emotion her children couldn't decipher. I understand what you did, she said, finally. But I can't simply erase those 3 years when you left me all alone. The children shrank back, the guilt weighing heavily on their shoulders. They knew it wouldn't be easy to obtain their mother's forgiveness. Mom, please, give us a chance to fix this, John pleaded. We want to be by your side from now on. Mrs. Maria sighed deeply, and to the children's surprise, her lips curved into a slight smile. Come in, my children. I have a lot to tell you. Not fully understanding their mother's reaction, the three followed her, feeling both relieved and apprehensive. They didn't know what awaited them, but they were determined to regain Mrs. Maria's love and forgiveness. After welcoming her children with kindness, Mrs. Maria invited them to make themselves comfortable in her office. Her eyes reflected a mix of emotions, between the hurt from the abandonment and the satisfaction of seeing them again. I'm surprised you've come to visit me, Mrs. Maria began, her voice calm. It's been a long time since the last time. John, the eldest son, cleared his throat, the guilt showing on his face. Mom, we don't even know how to ask for your forgiveness. We left you alone when you needed us the most. Mary Ann, with teary eyes, agreed. That's true, Mom. We abandoned you, and now we feel terribly ashamed of that. Peter, always the more reserved, averted his gaze, unable to look at his mother. We made a big mistake, Mom. We wish we could go back. Mrs. Maria observed them in silence for a few moments, before finally sighing deeply. I understand what you did and why you did it. But the truth is, at that moment, I felt deeply helpless. She raised her hand, preventing the children from interrupting her. However, I cannot ignore what happened. You abandoned me when I needed you the most. John, Marianne, and Peter lowered their heads, the weight of guilt crushing their hearts. They knew it wouldn't be easy to obtain their mother's forgiveness. Then, to their surprise, Mrs. Maria smiled gently. But despite everything, I'm happy to see that you've finally come to visit me. She paused, her eyes shining with an emotion her children couldn't identify. And I must say, I have a lot to tell you about what happened to me during that time. The children looked up, surprised and curious. They hadn't expected this reaction from their mother, and their hearts raced in anticipation. Do you remember the nurse I had at the nursing home? Mrs. Maria asked. Well, she became much more than just my nurse. She smiled, her expression softening. Nurse Joanna and I became partners in a health clinic that we founded together. John, Marianne, and Peter's eyes widened, completely shocked by the revelation. A health clinic? Marianne exclaimed, incredulous. But how? Mrs. Maria nodded, her face lit with evident pride. Yes, my children. And this clinic not only helped me recover, but it has also become a great success. She leaned forward a bit, her eyes shining with gratitude. I owe it all to Nurse Joanna's dedication and care. She was my greatest support during those years when you were absent. The children remained silent, absorbing this unexpected revelation. They couldn't believe that their mother, abandoned by them, had been able to rebuild her life with such determination and success. Mom, we had no idea, John stammered, still stunned. We became so blinded by our own greed that we didn't realize how much you needed us. Mrs. Maria nodded, her expression softening. I know, my son. But now you're here, and I'm happy to share this story with you. She extended her hand, caressing John's face with maternal affection. I can't erase the past, but I hope we can build a new future together. Marianne and Peter approached, embracing their mother with tears in their eyes. In that moment, they realized that, despite everything, Mrs. Maria still loved them and was willing to give them a new chance. After hearing Mrs. Maria's revelation about her achievement with the health clinic, the children were impressed and, at the same time, a little ashamed for having abandoned their mother. John, the eldest, cleared his throat, hesitant. Mom, we really had no idea about all that you were able to accomplish on your own. We're very proud. Marianne agreed, her eyes shining with admiration. That's true, Mom. You are an extraordinary woman. We should have been here to support you. Peter, however, couldn't hide his expression of surprise and even a slight resentment. But if you're doing so well in life, why didn't you help us financially all this time? Mrs. Maria looked at her youngest son calmly. Peter, I understand your question. After all, you left me here alone and used the money from the sale of my house for your own lives. John and Marianne shrank back, knowing their mother was right. Peter, in turn, crossed his arms, waiting for the response. But now that you're here, I'd like to have the opportunity to reconcile with you, Mrs. Maria continued, her voice soft. You are my children, and I love you. She paused, observing her children's reactions. And that's why I'd like to ask you to join me in this clinic. You could work with us and help us expand it even further. John and Marianne looked at each other, surprised by the invitation. Peter, however, didn't seem impressed. "So you want us to come work for you?" As if it were a handout. Mrs. Maria sighed, maintaining her composure. "No, my son. It's not a handout, it's an opportunity for us to rebuild our family ties. I want you to be involved in this project with me." Marianne smiled, touched by her mother's generosity. "I'd love to, Mom. It would be an honor to work by your side." John agreed, squeezing his mother's hand. "Yes, Mom. We want to be a part of this, if you'll have us." Peter, however, frowned, his expression distrustful. "And what if you simply don't need us anymore later on? What about our inheritance?" Mrs. Maria looked at her son with kindness, but her gaze reflected a slight disappointment. "Peter, my son, that's not the issue here. I called you because I love you and want to have you back in my life." She paused, carefully choosing her words. "But if you can't get involved with my work and with me, then I'll have to move forward alone, as I've always done." Peter opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by John. "Mom, we accept your invitation. We want to be a part of this, in whatever way you'll have us." Mrs. Maria smiled, relieved, and embraced her children. Although Peter still seemed reluctant, she hoped that, in time, he would also find his place in this new phase of their lives. After inviting her children to join her in the management of the clinic, Mrs. Maria observed their reactions closely. While John and Marianne were receptive, Peter still seemed reluctant and distrustful. "So, do you accept my invitation?" Mrs. Maria asked, her eyes shining with hope. John nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Mom. It will be an honor to work by your side and help expand the clinic." Marianne smiled, holding her mother's hand. "I accept too, Mom. This is an opportunity for us to reconnect." Peter, however, crossed his arms, his face hardened. "And what about our inheritance? What will happen to it?" Mrs. Maria sighed, looking at her youngest son with understanding. "Peter, my son, this isn't about that. I called you because I want to have you back in my life, not because of the money." She paused, carefully choosing her words. "But if you can't commit to my work and to me, then I'll have to move forward alone, as I've always done." Peter frowned, his expression distrustful. "So you're saying you won't need us anymore after?" Mrs. Maria shook her head. "No, Peter. I want you here, not because of the money, but because you are my children and I love you." John intervened, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Peter, understand that Mom is giving us an opportunity to reconnect. We should accept it with an open heart." Marianne nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "Yes, Peter. This is a chance for us to redeem ourselves and be together again." Peter seemed to waver for a moment, but still maintained his distrustful expression. "And what if she decides she doesn't need us anymore? What will happen to our inheritance?" Mrs. Maria sighed deeply, and to everyone's surprise, a determined expression took over her face. "My children, I've learned a lot from Nurse Joanna in these last few years. She taught me about the importance of care and generosity." She paused, her eyes shining with determination. "That's why I've made a decision. All of my inheritance, including the clinic, will be left to Nurse Joanna." The three children's eyes widened, shocked by the revelation. John and Marianne seemed perplexed, while Peter let his contained anger show. "But, Mom, we are your natural heirs," Peter exclaimed, indignant. How can you do this to us? Mrs. Maria raised her hand, silencing him. I know, my son. But Nurse Joanna supported me and helped me when I needed it the most. She deserves all of my gratitude. John and Marianne exchanged stunned looks, unsure of what to say. Peter, however, seemed about to explode with rage. That's not fair, he yelled. We are your family, you can't just exclude us. Mrs. Maria held her position, her expression serene but firm. My son, this is my final decision. I hope you can understand and accept it. Silence weighed heavily on the room as the children struggled to process this unexpected revelation. Mrs. Maria, however, showed no remorse, determined to honor the memory of the one who had helped her overcome the worst moments of her life. Mrs. Maria's words echoed through the room, leaving her 3 children stunned. John and Marianne looked at each other, perplexed, while Peter exploded in fury. This is absurd, Mother. Peter raged, his face red with anger. How can you leave everything to this nurse? We are your natural heirs. Mrs. Maria remained calm, facing her son firmly. My son, this is my final decision. Nurse Joanna helped me when I needed it the most, and she deserves all of my gratitude. John, trying to defuse the situation, touched his brother's shoulder. Mom, we understand that you're grateful to Nurse Joanna, but we are your family. Shouldn't we receive something from your inheritance? Marianne, with tears in her eyes, pleaded, Mom, please reconsider this decision. We've always loved you and want to be by your side. Mrs. Maria sighed deeply, her eyes reflecting the pain of having to face this situation. I know, my children. I know you are my family and that you love me. But I've learned from Nurse Joanna the importance of care and generosity. She paused, carefully choosing her words. You abandoned me when I needed you the most. Nurse Joanna, on the other hand, has been by my side all this time. Peter scoffed, his face contorted in an expression of rage. So that's it. We abandoned you, and now you're going to punish us by depriving us of our inheritance. Mrs. Maria raised her hand, interrupting him. My son, this is not about punishment. I simply want to honor Nurse Joanna's memory and repay everything she's done for me. John and Marianne seemed confused and hurt, unable to understand their mother's decision. Peter, in turn, did not hide his outrage. This is unfair. We are your children, not that nurse, he yelled, the veins in his neck popping. Mrs. Maria held her ground, her voice firm. I understand that you are disappointed. But this is my final decision. I hope that one day, you can understand and accept it. John, trying to calm the situation, placed himself between Peter and his mother. Mom, please, let's talk about this. You can't simply exclude us from your inheritance. Marianne nodded, holding her mother's hand. Yes, Mom. We want to be a part of your life and your legacy. Mrs. Maria looked at them kindly, but her determination was unwavering. My children, this is my final decision. Nurse Joanna deserves all of my gratitude and inheritance. Peter, beside himself, took a step towards his mother. This is absurd. You are being unfair and ungrateful. Mrs. Maria stepped back, concerned, but maintained her firm gaze. Peter, please calm down. This is my wish, and I hope you can respect it. The tension in the room was palpable, with the children outraged at their mother's resolution. John and Marianne tried to calm the situation, while Peter seemed on the verge of an outburst of fury. The tension in the room was palpable, with the children indignant at Mrs. Maria's resolution. Peter, the most agitated, took a step towards his mother, his face red with anger. "This is absurd, Mother," he yelled. "How can you leave everything to this nurse and exclude us from your inheritance? We are your family." Mrs. Maria stepped back a little, concerned about her son's reaction, but maintained her firm gaze. "Peter, please calm down. This is my final decision, and I hope you can respect it." John, trying to defuse the situation, placed himself between the two. "Mom, we understand that you are grateful to Nurse Joanna, but we are your children. Shouldn't we receive something from your inheritance?" Mary Ann, with tears in her eyes, pleaded, "Mom, please reconsider this decision. We've always loved you and want to be by your side." Mrs. Maria sighed deeply, her eyes reflecting the pain of having to face this situation. "I know, my children. I know you are my family and that you love me. But I've learned from Nurse Joanna the importance of care and generosity." She paused, carefully choosing her words. "You abandoned me when I needed you the most. Nurse Joanna, on the other hand, has been by my side all this time." Peter scoffed, his face contorted in an expression of rage. "So that's it. We abandoned you, and now you're going to punish us by depriving us of our inheritance." Mrs. Maria raised her hand, interrupting him. "My son, this is not about punishment. I simply want to honor Nurse Joanna's memory and repay everything she's done for me." John, trying to calm the situation, placed his hand on Peter's shoulder. "Mom, please, let's talk about this. You can't simply exclude us from your inheritance." Mary Ann nodded, holding her mother's hand. "Yes, Mom. We want to be a part of your life and your legacy." Mrs. Maria looked at them kindly, but her determination was unwavering. "My children, this is my final decision. Nurse Joanna deserves all of my gratitude and inheritance." Peter, beside himself, took a step towards his mother. "This is absurd. You are being unfair and ungrateful." Mrs. Maria stepped back, concerned, but maintained her firm gaze. "Peter, please calm down. This is my wish, and I hope you can respect it." John and Mary Ann tried to hold back Peter, who seemed about to lose control. The accusations and tears flowed freely, while Mrs. Maria remained resolute in her decision. "You don't understand," Peter cried, his face streaked with tears of rage. "We are your family, not that nurse." Mrs. Maria sighed deeply, her voice heavy with emotion. "My son, I understand your pain and anger. But Nurse Joanna supported me and helped me when I needed it the most. She deserves my gratitude." John, in a last-ditch effort to convince his mother, held her hand. "Mom, please, think again. We want to be part of your legacy, not just Nurse Joanna." Mary Ann, with tears in her eyes, pleaded, "Mom, we love you so much. Don't push us away from your life and your inheritance." Mrs. Maria looked at them with sadness, but her resolve was unshakable. "My children, this is my final decision. I hope that one day you can understand and forgive me." The confrontation between the mother and her children reached a painful climax, with accusations, tears, and an inability to reconcile. Mrs. Maria maintained her position, while her children struggled to accept her unexpected decision. After the intense confrontation with her children, Mrs. Maria looked at them with a serene yet determined expression. She knew she needed to explain the reason for her decision to them, in the hope that they could understand it, even if they didn't agree. "My children, I know that my decision has shocked and deeply hurt you," Mrs. Maria said, her voice calm. "But I ask that you listen to me carefully." John, Marianne, and Peter fell silent, though their expressions reflected the deep indignation they felt. Mrs. Maria took a deep breath and continued, "The lesson I've learned in these past years is the importance of care and dedication. You, my own children, abandoned me when I needed you the most." She paused, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I felt profoundly helpless and alone at that moment. But Nurse Joanna, a simple nurse, supported me and helped me recover." The children lowered their heads, ashamed, as their mother continued. "Despite being my children, you turned your backs on me." Nurse Joanna, on the other hand, demonstrated the generosity and care that you should have shown me. John, with guilt etched on his face, tried to justify himself. "Mom, we had no idea how much you needed us. We were blinded by our own ambition." Marianne nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's true, Mom. We abandoned you, and we deeply regret that." Peter, still indignant, crossed his arms, avoiding eye contact. "But that doesn't mean you should deprive us of our inheritance. We are your family." Mrs. Maria raised her hand, interrupting him. "My son, that's not the issue here. You abandoned me, and Nurse Joanna supported me. She deserves my gratitude and my inheritance." She paused, her eyes shining with determination. "My children, the lesson I've learned is that care and dedication are worth far more than blood ties. Nurse Joanna proved that by helping me when you did not." John and Marianne looked at each other, their guilt and remorse evident. Peter, however, frowned, still resisting his mother's decision. "But, Mom, we are your natural heirs," he argued, his voice sounding resentful. "How can you leave everything to this nurse?" Mrs. Maria looked at her son with kindness, but firmness. "Peter, my son, Nurse Joanna supported me and helped me recover when I needed it the most. She deserves this reward for her dedication." She extended her hand, touching her son's face. "You are my children, and I love you. But the lesson I've learned is the importance of care and generosity. And that is what I want to leave as my legacy." John and Marianne approached, embracing their mother affectionately. Although still confused and hurt, they understood, at least partially, the lesson Mrs. Maria was trying to impart. Peter, on the other hand, remained distant, his expression laden with resentment. He seemed unable to accept his mother's decision, even in the face of her explanations. Mrs. Maria looked at them tenderly, hoping that in time, her children could understand the true essence of her life lesson. After the emotional confrontation with her children, Mrs. Maria knew the time had come to put her final decision into practice. She summoned Nurse Joanna, her loyal companion in these past years, for a meeting. "Nurse Joanna, I've called you here because I have something very important to tell you," Mrs. Maria began, her voice heavy with emotion. Nurse Joanna observed her attentively, her eyes reflecting concern. "What is it, Mrs. Maria? Has something happened?" Mrs. Maria sighed deeply and then looked at the nurse seriously. "Nurse Joanna, I've made a decision that will change the course of our lives." She paused, carefully choosing her words. "I've decided that my entire inheritance, including the clinic we built together, will be left to you." Nurse Joanna's eyes widened, shocked by the revelation. "But, Mrs. Maria, what are you saying?" This can't be true. Mrs. Maria nodded, her face reflecting determination. It's true, Nurse Joanna. You supported me and helped me recover when my own children abandoned me. I want you to be the heir to everything we've built. Tears streamed down the nurse's face, her voice choked with emotion. Mrs. Maria, I don't know what to say. This is so unexpected. Mrs. Maria held Nurse Joanna's hands, her expression serene. My dear friend, you deserve this. You were the only one who stood by my side when I needed it the most. My children abandoned me, but you rescued me. Nurse Joanna shook her head, still stunned. But, Mrs. Maria, what about your children? They are your natural heirs. I can't accept this. Mrs. Maria smiled gently. I've talked to them, Nurse Joanna. They didn't understand my decision, but this is my final wish. She paused, her eyes shining with determination. You've taught me about the importance of care and generosity. That's what I want to leave as my legacy. Nurse Joanna squeezed Mrs. Maria's hands, her voice trembling. Mrs. Maria, I don't know how to thank you. You are the most generous and noble person I've ever known. Mrs. Maria smiled, her expression conveying tranquility. There's no need for thanks, my dear. You deserve this and so much more. This is my final wish. She took the legal documents and, in front of Nurse Joanna, began to sign them, formalizing the transfer of her inheritance. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face reflected a calm determination. When she finished, Mrs. Maria handed the documents to Nurse Joanna, her eyes shining with pride. Now, the clinic and everything we've built together belong to you, my friend. Nurse Joanna couldn't hold back the tears, her voice choked with emotion. Mrs. Maria, I don't know how to thank you. You are an angel in my life. I promise to honor your memory and continue your legacy. Mrs. Maria embraced her with affection, feeling light and at peace with herself. She knew her decision had caused pain in her children, but her conscience was clear. While the children, still outraged, left the clinic, Mrs. Maria remained there, watching Nurse Joanna with a serene smile. She knew that her life lesson would be perpetuated, and that her legacy would be in the hands of someone who valued and would honor it. With a light heart, Mrs. Maria prepared for the next chapter of her life, confident that her decision had been the right one. She knew that even if her children never forgave her, her life lesson about care and dedication would prevail.